The courtroom was silent in a way that didn't feel like silence at all. It felt like holding your breath underwater. Officer Sarah Calloway stood at the defendant's table with her wrists crossed in front of her, chin up, eyes dry. She had been trained to keep her composure in the worst moments. She had pulled children from burning cars. She had talked men off bridges at 2 in the morning. She had buried colleagues. She had not been trained for this. The judge's gavel came down, and the woman who had given 12 years of her life to the law, who had trusted the badge with everything she had, was handcuffed in the very same courtroom where she had once testified against killers. Nobody asked about Ghost. Nobody asked what would happen to her dog. That was the detail that broke her, not the verdict, not the cameras, not her mother weeping in the 3rd row. It was knowing that somewhere, in a kennel on the other side of the city, a white German shepherd was waiting for a door to open that was never going to open again. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, please hit like and subscribe. It means everything. And I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments below. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. Harlow Falls was the kind of town that looked better from a distance. From the Ridge Highway coming in from the east, it looked almost peaceful. A cluster of church steeples above a canopy of old oaks. A silver river bending around its southern edge. Brick storefronts that had been there since before anyone's grandfather was born. In autumn, tourists stopped to take photographs. They called it charming. They called it quiet. They didn't stay long enough to learn what lived beneath the quiet. Harlow Falls had a corruption problem. Not the dramatic, headline-grabbing kind you see in crime dramas. This was slower and more insidious. The kind that grows in the spaces between handshakes. In back offices, in favors exchanged over golf courses, in the careful cultivation of which voices got amplified and which ones got silenced. The Harlow Falls Police Department had been infected by it for nearly 2 decades, and it had learned, over time, to look exactly like integrity from the outside. The autumn Sarah Calloway was arrested was a cold one. October had come in sharp and early, stripping the oaks bare before they were ready. The streets were perpetually damp. The river ran high. People kept their heads down and moved quickly from their cars to their doors, as if the cold itself had a personality they didn't want to engage with. It was into this town, on a morning that smelled of wet leaves and exhaust, that the news broke. A decorated officer, 12-year veteran, canine handler, 2 commendations for valor, had been charged with evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The town's reaction was swift and predictable. Half of them said they always knew something was off about her. The other half said nothing, because silence had always been the safer language in Harlow Falls. Sarah Calloway had not always been someone people underestimated. She had been the kind of child who memorized train schedules for fun, who organized neighborhood recycling drives at age 9, who argued with her father's friends about fairness at the dinner table, and never backed down no matter how many adults tried to redirect the conversation. Her mother used to say she was born with a compass instead of a heart. Always pointed toward what was right, even when the terrain in that direction was rough. She joined the police academy at 22 after 2 years of pre-law, a choice that confused some of her professors and delighted none of them. She'd told them all the same thing. She didn't want to argue about the law from a leather chair. She wanted to live inside it. For the first 8 years, the work had been everything she'd hoped. She'd excelled in patrol, made detective faster than most, was recommended for the K-9 unit by her lieutenant after she single-handedly tracked a missing teenager through 12 miles of backcountry using nothing but a trail map and gut instinct. When they placed Ghost in her arms, a white German shepherd puppy, 6 weeks old, with ice-pale eyes and enormous paws he hadn't grown into, she had understood immediately what people meant when they talked about a bond that was beyond explaining. Ghost was extraordinary, not in the showy bark-on-command way. He was quiet, methodical. He processed the world through his nose the way Sarah processed it through her mind, systematically, exhaustively, cross-referencing every new piece of information against everything that had come before. They worked together with a synchronicity that other handlers in the unit found almost unsettling to watch. Ghost seemed to anticipate her decisions before she made them. She seemed to feel his alerts before his body even completed them. They worked narcotics, homicide support, 3 years of missing persons cases, 4 of which involved children who came home alive because Ghost had found them when no one else could. It was the missing persons work that eventually led Sarah to the thing that would destroy her life. It started with a 12-year-old girl named Mara Delgado. Mara had disappeared on a Tuesday. She was found alive on a Thursday, 2 counties over, in a condemned warehouse. The man who had taken her, a local named Dennis Holt with a long record of assault, was arrested the same night. It should have been a clean case. It should have been straightforward. It wasn't. At trial, a critical piece of evidence, a digital recording recovered from Holt's phone, was ruled inadmissible. The defense claimed it had been tampered with. The chain of custody was questioned. Holt walked. Sarah had processed that evidence. Her name was on every form. What no one in the courtroom said, what no one seemed willing to investigate, was that the chain of custody had been disrupted before it ever reached Sarah. Someone with access to the evidence locker and far more seniority than she had had altered the intake logs. Sarah had found the discrepancy 3 weeks before the trial. She had reported it. She had filed the paperwork. She had sent 2 emails to the chief of detectives and 1 to internal affairs. None of those communications were ever logged. What was logged instead was a report filed against Sarah Calloway, signed by Detective Leonard Pruitt, 23 years on the force, alleging that she had tampered with evidence in the Delgado case in an attempt to cover up her own procedural errors. The investigation that followed lasted 4 months. Sarah cooperated with everything. She answered every question. She handed over her personal devices. She submitted to 2 polygraphs, both of which she passed. It didn't matter. Leonard Pruitt had been building cases and alliances in Harlow Falls for over 2 decades. He knew which judges golfed with the police union president. He knew which city council member's son had a sealed juvenile record that certain people were very motivated to keep sealed. He knew how power worked in this town because he had helped construct its architecture, brick by careful brick. Sarah was 34 years old, 12 years on the force, with a perfect service record and a white German shepherd who had never failed her once. She never stood a chance. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on 2 counts. 3 years minimum security. The day she was taken from the courthouse in handcuffs. Ghost was in a kennel at the K9 facility 3 miles away. He had not been out on a run in 2 days. He kept returning to the gate of his enclosure and pressing his nose through the chain link, scenting the air, tail still, waiting. They tried to reassign Ghost to a new handler. Twice. The first officer they paired him with, a well-regarded young handler named Marcus Webb, who had an excellent track record with difficult dogs, lasted 9 days. Ghost didn't bite him, didn't growl, didn't exhibit any of the behaviors that would have justified a behavioral flag. He simply refused to work. He would sit at the start of a search pattern and look at the ground. He would lie down in the middle of a tracking exercise and rest his head on his paws as though the entire operation was beneath his attention. When Marcus tried to engage him with play with the ball Ghost had always loved, the battered tennis ball that Sarah had kept in her jacket pocket since his first week of training, Ghost looked at it for a long moment and then looked away, as if the ball reminded him of someone he was trying not to think about. The second handler, a woman named Joanne Park who had 15 years of experience and a gentleness that most animals responded to immediately, lasted 11 days. Ghost ate fine, slept fine, let her brush him without complaint. But in the field, he was absent in some way that no one could diagnose or document. He moved through the motions of the work like a machine running on low power. He was there, and he wasn't there. The K9 unit coordinator, a man named Don Yates who had seen a lot of difficult dogs in his career, wrote in his report, "This animal appears to be experiencing something consistent with grief. Recommend evaluation and possible retirement." Ghost was 8 years old. Not old for a German shepherd, but not young either. Don Yates made some calls. The Harlow Falls Animal Rescue Center agreed to take him. Ghost spent 4 months in the shelter. He was clean, well-behaved, gentle with the volunteers. He passed his temperament assessments with flying marks. He was described in the adoption profile that one of the younger volunteers spent 45 minutes crafting as a noble, thoughtful companion for an experienced dog owner. Every morning, without fail, Ghost would walk to the east-facing corner of the outdoor run and stand there, nose lifted, eyes half closed, facing the direction of Harlow Falls Correctional Facility. Though he could not have known the geography, could not have known that Sarah was 7 miles away, waking up in a 6-by-9 cell, trying not to think about him either. The volunteers noticed, but they didn't know what to make of it, until Frank. Franklin Adler was 71 years old, recently widowed, and deeply suspicious of anyone who told him he needed to slow down. He had driven ambulances for 30 years. Then, after his retirement, and before his wife Dolores passed, he had spent 6 years volunteering at the animal shelter on weekends. When Dolores died, a Tuesday in February, peaceful, in their own bedroom, with the window cracked the way she liked, Frank had gone back to the shelter the following Saturday, not because he didn't know how to grieve, but because he knew that grief needed somewhere to put itself. He had been at the shelter the morning Ghost arrived. He remembered watching the K9 transport van pull into the lot and thinking, before the doors even opened, that something important was about to happen. He couldn't have told you why. He just felt it. That specific electricity in the air that usually preceded something worth paying attention to. Ghost stepped out of the van with his head up and his tail neutral. Not aggressive, not afraid. Composed in a way that was almost formal. He scanned the yard with those pale eyes, and when his gaze reached Frank, it stayed there for a beat longer than it should have. Frank had found himself standing up straighter without meaning to. They'd become something in the weeks that followed. Not owner and dog. Ghost wasn't his yet, but something. Frank would come in, and Ghost would be at the fence waiting. They would walk the perimeter of the yard together in companionable quiet. Frank with his hands in his coat pockets, Ghost slightly ahead, glancing back now and then to make sure Frank was keeping up. It was during one of these walks, 3 weeks in, that Frank noticed the east-facing ritual for the first time. Ghost had stopped at his corner, as he did every morning. Nose lifted, ears forward, eyes tracking something invisible on the horizon. "What are you looking for, boy?" Frank said quietly. Ghost didn't answer, of course, but his tail moved. Once, slowly, as if acknowledging the question, even if he couldn't respond to it. Frank started paying attention. Every day, same corner, same direction, same expression, not anxious, not distressed. Patient, like a man waiting at a train station who knows the train is running late but hasn't given up on it arriving. Frank was a practical man. He didn't believe in magic and had limited patience for sentimentality, but he had spent 30 years driving ambulances, which meant he had spent 30 years learning to read the space between what things appeared to be and what they actually were. He had a nose for meaning, for the detail that everyone else walks past because they were moving too fast. He started asking questions at the shelter. This K9 dog, Ghost, what you know about his handler? The youngest volunteer, a college girl named Priya who kept printed out animal facts taped to the break room wall, looked up from her laptop. "Oh, that's kind of a sad story, actually. His handler was a police officer. She got convicted of evidence tampering a few months ago. She's at Harlow Correctional." Frank went still. "Evidence tampering," he repeated. "Yeah. It was all over the news. Calloway, I think. Sarah Calloway." Frank went home that evening and spent 4 hours on his computer. He read every article he could find about the Sarah Calloway case. He read the trial summaries that a legal blog had published. He read a brief, meticulous opinion piece by a retired judge who had reviewed the publicly available transcripts and noted, in careful language, several procedural irregularities that had not been adequately addressed by the defense. He read about Leonard Pruitt. He looked at photographs of Pruitt's retirement party the previous December, 10 months after Sarah's conviction. Pruitt was smiling in every photograph. There was a cake. There were balloons. The chief of police was there, arm around Pruitt's shoulder. Frank looked at the photographs for a long time. Then he called the shelter coordinator and said he'd like to adopt Ghost. He adopted him on a Friday. That Sunday he drove to Harlow Falls Correctional Facility and requested a visitor's appointment with inmate Sarah Calloway. He was not what Sarah expected. She'd been told a visitor was coming, one she hadn't requested, which was unusual enough to make her cautious. She'd walked into the visitation room with her arms crossed and her guard up, expecting a journalist or a lawyer with something to sell. Instead, She found a thin, upright, silver-haired man with careful eyes and a wool coat that had seen better decades. He introduced himself and sat down and folded his hands on the table. "I adopted your dog," he said. The words hit Sarah like a physical thing. Her arms dropped to her sides. "Ghost," she said. It wasn't a question. It was the name of something she had not allowed herself to say out loud in 6 months. "Ghost," Frank confirmed. "He faces east every morning. Has since the day he arrived at the shelter. I've been watching him do it for 3 weeks, and I think he's been doing it since before I got there." Sarah said nothing. She pressed her lips together and looked at the table and said nothing. "I've been reading about your case," Frank continued. His voice was even. Matter of fact, the way people with medical backgrounds tend to be when discussing difficult things, not cold, just clear. "I read the trial transcripts. I read the judge's opinion. I read an analysis by a retired circuit court judge who thought the same thing I did after reading it." Sarah looked up. "Which is what?" "That something went wrong," Frank said. "And not with you." The silence between them lasted a long time. "You're not the first person to say that," Sarah said at last. Her voice was controlled. She had practiced control every single day she'd been in this facility, saying it doesn't change anything. "I filed reports. I documented everything. It disappeared." "What exactly did you document?" Frank asked. And so Sarah told him, not because she expected it to matter, not because she had any reason to trust this stranger in a wool coat who had walked in off the street and adopted her dog. She told him because she had been holding the story inside her like a stone for 6 months, and something about the way he sat, hands folded, head slightly forward, attending to her with the full weight of his attention, made the stone feel lighter. She told him about the intake log discrepancies, the altered timestamps, the email she had sent to IA that had never been logged, the specific identifying details of the original evidence file. Details she had memorized because she memorized everything, because Ghost had taught her that details were how you found what was actually true. Frank listened. He did not take notes. He did not interrupt. He just listened, and his eyes were steady. And when she finished, he said, "Who had access to the evidence locker between intake and your processing?" Sarah recited it from memory. There were 5 names. Pruitt's was the 4th. "He had access," she said, "but when I raised it, I was told his access log was clean. No entries around the relevant window. Could the access log itself have been altered?" Sarah's eyes sharpened. "You'd need administrator credentials for the evidence management system. Pruitt didn't have those." "Who did?" The pause lasted 3 seconds. "The chief of detectives, and his deputy, and the IT administrator." She stopped. "The IT administrator retired the month after my conviction." Frank nodded slowly. "I'd like to help you," he said. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm not connected to anyone in the system. What I am is someone with a lot of time and a very stubborn disposition, and a dog who is waiting at a fence every morning for you to come back." Sarah looked at him. For the first time in 6 months, something moved in her chest that wasn't dread. "Why?" she said. "Why would you do this?" Frank was quiet for a moment. When he answered, he didn't look away from her. "Because I drove an ambulance for 30 years, he said. "And in 30 years I learned that the most dangerous moment in an emergency isn't the one that looks like an emergency. It's the one that looks like everything's fine. That's where people die. When everybody's walked past the thing that's actually wrong because they were moving too fast to see it." He reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the table between them. A battered tennis ball, faded green, tooth-marked at the seams. "He carries this every morning," Frank said, "to his corner. Then he sets it down and waits." Sarah put her hand over her mouth. Her eyes went bright. She didn't cry. She was Sarah Calloway and she had been trained not to cry. But her hand stayed over her mouth for a long time. And when she finally lowered it, her voice was quieter than it had been. "Tell him." She stopped, started again. "Tell him I'm coming. When you go back, tell him I'm coming." What Frank found over the next 4 months was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was meticulous, quiet, and slow, the kind of work that looks like nothing from the outside but that requires enormous stamina to sustain. It was the work of a man who had once kept a woman's heart beating in the back of a moving vehicle for 47 minutes through nothing but rhythm and will. He hired a private investigator through the retired judge's recommendation. A woman named Carla Osei, based in the state capital, who specialized in police misconduct cases and who had, in Frank's estimation, the most comprehensively skeptical mind he had ever encountered. He paid her from his savings. He did not discuss the amount with anyone. Carla Osei pulled threads. She found the IT administrator, a man named Gerald Coe, living in a condo in Florida on a pension that was, by Carla's calculation, approximately 30% higher than it should have been given his salary history and stated retirement savings. She found a discrepancy in the evidence management system's audit log, a 14-minute gap on a specific evening that the system's own error log documented, but that had never been flagged. She found that 3 of the 5 people who had access to the evidence locker on the relevant date had signed in using physical key logs, but one of them had not signed in at all. Not because Pruitt hadn't been there, because his access had been logged under a secondary credential, one that belonged, on paper, to a detective who had been on medical leave that entire week. It took 11 weeks to find that. It took another 3 weeks to find the photograph. It was a still from a security camera of the parking garage adjacent to the police department. Team stamped, Pruitt's vehicle, arriving at 11:42 p.m. on the night in question. Gerald Coe's vehicle, arriving 4 minutes later. The same camera, 31 minutes after that, capturing both vehicles leaving. A parking garage camera. Not the evidence locker. Not admissible on its own. But enough. Enough to approach the State Attorney General's office with a formal complaint backed by documented discrepancies, a retired judge's written analysis, and the testimony of Gerald Coe, who, when confronted with the parking garage footage and the pension discrepancy, retained a lawyer and began a conversation about cooperation that lasted 2.5 hours. The day Carla Osei called Frank to tell him that the AG's office had opened a formal investigation into Detective Leonard Pruitt and one Chief of Detectives Aaron Marsh, Frank was sitting in his kitchen with Ghost's head on his knee. He set down the phone. He looked at the dog. Ghost looked back at him with those pale eyes that held everything and revealed nothing. "She's coming home, boy," Frank said. Ghost's tail moved in a slow, certain arc, as if he had always known. The formal exoneration hearing was held on a Thursday morning in early spring. The courtroom was the same one in which Sarah had been convicted. Frank had wondered if that detail would be difficult for her. He had asked, during one of their visits, whether she wanted him to request a different venue. "No," she'd said. "Same room. I want it undone in the same room." She had been released from Harlow Correctional 3 days earlier, pending the outcome of the hearing, on a conditional order. She walked out at 6 a.m. into a grey morning, carrying a box with her personal effects. Frank had been waiting in the parking lot with his wool coat and his careful eyes. And Ghost. He had debated whether to bring the dog. He'd worried it would be overwhelming. Too emotional. Too much. The kind of moment that could collapse under its own weight. But Ghost had made the decision for him that morning by walking directly to the car door and sitting next to it with the absolute certainty of a being who knew exactly where he needed to be. When the correctional facility doors opened and Sarah stepped out, Ghost saw her before she saw him. He didn't bark. He didn't run. He stood up from his sit, very slowly. And he made a sound that was not quite a whine, and not quite a word. Something in between. Something that lived in a register below language, and he walked toward her, deliberately, as though each step was a sentence in a paragraph he had been composing for 3 years. Sarah saw him. She said his name once, and then she was on her knees on the cold asphalt of a prison parking lot with her arms around a white German shepherd and her face pressed into his neck and her whole body shaking. Finally shaking. With the 3 years of weight she had refused to put down until this moment. Ghost stood very still. He let her hold him. His tail moved in that same slow, certain arc. Frank stood by the car with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the grey sky and thought about Dolores. We'd always said that the most important thing a person could do was to show up for the moments that mattered, even, especially, the ones that weren't yours. At the exoneration hearing, the evidence was presented methodically. Carlos had done her work well. The parking garage footage, the audit log gap, the secondary credential, Gerald Coe's testimony, delivered in a flat, careful voice that had the particular quality of a man who has decided that saving himself is the only remaining option. The retired judge's analysis of the trial record. The email Sarah had sent to Internal Affairs, which had been recovered from an archived server that Pruitt had not known existed. Leonard Pruitt sat at the defendant's table and looked to the floor. Aaron Marsh sat beside his attorney and said nothing. When the judge spoke, she did not take long. The facts were not complicated. They had only ever been buried. She set aside Sarah Calloway's conviction on all counts. She stated, in language that appeared in every news article written about the case in the following days, that the evidence of prosecutorial and investigative misconduct was unambiguous, substantial, and deeply troubling. She ordered an immediate review of every case in the past decade in which Detective Leonard Pruitt had been a primary investigator. The room exhaled. Sarah sat at the defense table and did not move for several seconds. Her attorney put a hand on her shoulder. She placed her hand over her attorney's hand. Then she looked across the courtroom to the gallery, to the second row where Frank was sitting with Ghost. Ghost was watching her. He had been watching her from the moment they entered the courtroom. His pale eyes had not moved from her face through the entire proceeding, as though he was the one standing witness, as though he had always been the one standing witness, through all of it, and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up to what he already knew. Sarah held his gaze, and something that had been locked inside her for 3 years and 2 months and 14 days quietly, finally, opened. The weeks that followed were not simple. They were never going to be simple. Sarah was 37 years old with a 3-year gap in her employment record, a wrongful conviction that had been overturned, but that still existed in the social memory of Harlow Falls, and the mother who cried every time she saw her and apologized for things that hadn't been her fault. She had missed a friend's wedding. She had missed her nephew's first words and first steps and first day of school. She had missed 3 Christmases and 2 birthdays, and a summer that people who had been free had spent complaining about the heat. You didn't just step back into your life after something like that. You built a new one alongside the rubble of the old one, and you didn't pretend the rubble wasn't there. Sarah moved into her mother's house for the first month. She slept with the windows open, even in the cold, because she was not ready to give up the ability to hear the night. She walked every morning. Long walks, no destination, just movement, just the reassurance of choosing where her feet went next. Ghost walked beside her, always beside her, not ahead, not behind, beside. She got a therapist. She didn't tell anyone she'd gotten a therapist for 2 months. And then she mentioned it to Frank over coffee, and he said, "Good," without elaboration, in the tone of someone who had been waiting for her to say it. She gave one interview. A print journalist from the state capitol who had followed the story carefully and who asked good questions and listened to the answers without interrupting. Sarah told the truth as precisely as she could, not because she owed anyone her story, but because Mara Delgado, the 12-year-old girl whose case had been at the center of all of this, was now 15, and her case remained unresolved because the evidence tampering had corrupted the prosecution. And Sarah thought that if the truth being told publicly helped move that case forward by even a fraction, then the discomfort of telling it was worth it. Mara Delgado's case was reopened 2 months after the interview ran. Dennis Holt was rearrested 6 weeks after that, under a prosecution that had been rebuilt from the ground up, on evidence that had been painstakingly recollected and that no one, not Pruitt, not Marsh, not Gerald Coe, had ever touched. Sarah did not attend the second trial. She followed it online from her mother's kitchen table with a cup of tea and Ghost's head in her lap when the guilty verdict came in on a Tuesday afternoon, unexpected in its timing but not in its content. She sat still for a moment, tea gone cold in her hand. Then she looked down at Ghost. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." Ghost lit her hand once, slowly. Frank came over for dinner that Friday. He brought wine because Sarah's mother had asked him to. He brought Ghost's ball, which had somehow migrated from his house to hers and back so many times over the past months that neither of them was entirely sure who it technically belonged to anymore. They ate at the kitchen table. Sarah, her mother, Frank, and they talked about ordinary things. The weather. The documentary about migratory birds that Frank had been watching. Sarah's mother's garden, which had gotten away from itself over the winter and needed attention. Ghost lay under the table with his chin on his paws, monitoring the conversation with the patient attention of someone who understood more than he was letting on. After dinner, Sarah walked Frank to his car. The night was mild, properly spring now. The kind of spring that felt like it meant it. The oak in her mother's front yard had finally leafed out, dark green against the navy sky. "I don't know how to say it properly," Sarah said. "What you did." Frank put his hands in his coat pockets, an old habit she'd noticed. His thinking posture. "You don't have to say it," he said. "I know I don't have to." She looked out at the dark street. "But I want to, because in there, when I had nothing to hold on to, knowing that someone was looking into it, that someone cared about the actual truth of it." She stopped, steadied herself. "You were looking for me before you ever met me." Frank considered that. "Ghost was looking for you," he said. "I just followed where he was pointing." Sarah looked back at the house. Through the kitchen window, she could see her mother washing dishes, humming something to herself. And there, at the window, front paws on the sill, pale eyes reflecting the streetlight. Ghost, watching her, still watching. "He never stopped," she said. "No," Frank agreed. "He didn't." They stood there a moment in the mild spring night, the oak rustling softly above them. "What are you going to do next?" Frank asked. "With all of it, the job, the I don't know yet," Sarah said. She said it without apology, without anxiety. 3 years ago, not knowing would have made her uncomfortable. She had always needed a plan, a direction, a clear line between here and the place she was going. She had learned, in a 6x9 cell with nothing but time, that sometimes not knowing was the only honest answer, and that honest answers, even uncomfortable ones, were always preferable to clean lies. "I know I'm not going back to that department," she said, "and I know I want to work with the K9 program in some capacity. Training, maybe. Advocacy. Ghost shouldn't have been left in limbo for as long as he was. There's no protocol for what happens to a K9 whose handler is incarcerated. That needs to change." Frank nodded. "That sounds exactly right." She looked at him. "I mean it, Frank. I don't know how to say thank you, but I'm going to spend a long time trying." He shook his head, not dismissively, but with the finality of someone closing a door on a subject that had been sufficiently addressed. "Go inside," he said. "It's getting cold." She almost argued. Instead, she surprised them both by stepping forward and hugging him. Brief, fierce, real. Then she stepped back, nodded once, and went inside. Frank stood by his car for a moment in the quiet spring night. He looked up at the oak tree. He thought about Dolores. He thought about 30 years of ambulance runs, the ones that ended well and the ones that didn't, and the way experience had taught him that what determined the difference was usually not the severity of the emergency. It was whether someone had noticed it soon enough, whether someone had been paying attention. He thought about a white German shepherd standing at a fence every morning, nose lifted, eyes half closed, facing the direction of someone who needed to be found. He got in his car. He drove home through the mild spring night with the window cracked, the way Dolores had always liked it. Sometimes, loyalty doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't ask whether the odds are fair, or whether the road is long, or whether anyone else has bothered to notice that something is wrong. It simply stands at the fence every morning, facing the direction of the truth and waits, with the absolute, unshakable certainty of a being who has never once confused devotion with weakness. Ghost knew. He had always known. He was just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up.